Welcome to the debate. When structural engineers design a skyscraper, they don't exactly ask the steel beams to creatively discover their own load-bearing capacity, right? They don't use unstructured, open-ended experiences for that.
Right, no. Because if you get the physics wrong there, the foundation cracks and the entire structure just collapses. It's very comforting to have that kind of binary, predictable framework.
Exactly. It's safe and, more importantly, it demonstrably works. They rely on rigorously tested materials placed with absolute mathematical precision.
Mm-hmm.
But when we look at how we build human minds, the architecture of our modern educational system, suddenly we're being told that this kind of structural precision is obsolete.
Yeah.
We are being urged to basically abandon the rigid steel frame of traditional instruction for this sort of free-flowing experiential methodology.
Which sounds chaotic at first glance, I admit, until you look closely and realize that the ground beneath our educational skyscraper is shifting so violently that, well, the rigid buildings are the ones currently snapping in half.
So today we are examining the fundamental purpose and really the most effective mechanics of a modern educational system. Specifically, the deep tension between highly structured, standardized instruction models and progressive experiential pedagogies.
Right, most notably project-based learning, or PBL.
Exactly. The central question we're unpacking is this: should education remain fiercely focused on the rigorous, direct transmission of foundational content knowledge?
Or must it fundamentally pivot toward experiential projects and, the development of soft skills to prevent honestly, a catastrophic wave of degree inflation and mass graduate unemployment?
Right. And our discussion today is grounded in several key pieces of source material. First, a comprehensive 2012 empirical review analyzing project-based learning versus direct instruction.
Specifically in science and economics classrooms.
Yes. We're also pulling from a sprawling 2024 data analysis on degree inflation and the higher ed crisis in India, historical evaluations of the 18th century Prussian education system, and a century of workplace research detailing the resistance to teaching soft skills.
So, to put my cards on the table right away, I argue that the traditional factory model of education is fundamentally broken. It's causing severe skills mismatches and massive unemployment, which proves the absolute urgent need for experiential, specialized, and soft skill-focused pedagogies.
And I defend the structured, direct instruction model as the empirically reliable bedrock of education. I argue that progressive models like project-based learning are, frankly, statistically overhyped, frequently ill-defined, and they just distract from the essential, measurable transmission of foundational knowledge.
Well, let's get right into the heart of the failure we're currently witnessing then. The reason I look at the traditional standardized model, what we often call the factory model, and see a completely broken system is because the macroeconomic reality is absolutely screaming at us.
Screaming in what way exactly?
We are mass-producing generalist degrees that completely ignore the actual functional needs of the modern economy. Just consider the fallout in India right now, based on that 2024 data.
Mm-hmm.
We are seeing overall graduate unemployment approaching 30%. And it's not just the lower-tier institutions feeling this. Even at the elite Indian institutes of technology, the IITs, placement rates have plummeted below 70%.
Which, those are genuinely staggering numbers.
They are terrifying. That means 30% of the absolute brightest engineering minds in a booming economy are leaving without jobs. And why? Because the system was designed in 18th century Prussia to stamp out compliant, identical workers.
I think that's a bit reductive, but okay.
But modern employers don't want identical workers. They want judgment, character, efficiency. In fact, a foundational 1918 Carnegie Foundation study showed that 80% of professional success relies on those exact soft skills. Direct instruction, by its very nature, completely ignores the 80% of what makes a human being valuable in the real world.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective, based on the empirical realities of cognitive science. How human beings actually acquire and store knowledge.
Okay.
The push for these 21st century skills and project-based learning is, frankly, it's an ideological fad, rather than an empirical necessity. When researchers comprehensively reviewed the data in that 2012 thesis, they systematically dismantled the grand claims made by advocates of PBL.
Dismantled is a strong word.
But it's accurate. The empirical evidence supporting PBL over traditional direct instruction is remarkably weak. Yes, studies show that PBL yields statistically significant gains, but in statistics, significance just means the result isn't a random accident.
Right, but a gain is a gain, is it not? I mean, progress is progress.
Not when you look at the raw numbers. The actual raw score improvements in content knowledge are incredibly marginal. We're talking often just a 5 to 6% increase on standardized tests.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in studies suffering from severe design flaws like a lack of randomized sampling. Dismantling an incredibly efficient, time-tested framework that successfully transfers knowledge for a negligible 5% bump in test scores, it's just an intellectually and practically flawed strategy.
Well, I come at it from a completely different way, because focusing on a 5% bump on a traditional content test completely misses the forest for the trees. Let's look at how those tests are fundamentally designed to evaluate the wrong things entirely.
Wait, let's ground this in the specific findings first, before we just throw out the tests altogether.
Fine.
Take one of the gold standard studies from 2010 analyzed in the source material. It looked at high school economics, and it had a massive sample size. Over 3,300 students across multiple states.
The Finkelstein study, right?
Yes. The teachers in the experimental group received 40 hours of intensive training. They used a highly specialized, heavily funded project-based curriculum. It was the perfect, idealized environment for PBL to shine.
Okay, and the result?
The PBL group scored exactly 2.6 points higher out of 40 mock-on-fee on a standard economics test compared to the direct instruction control group. In statistical terms, that's an effect size of 0.32. To translate that from academic jargon into reality, it's barely a blip.
Right, a moderate but real effect size.
Moderate is being incredibly generous. It's the equivalent of a student studying all weekend just to get one extra multiple choice question right on a massive final exam. Let me offer an analogy. Go ahead. Imagine the educational establishment is a doctor, and they are aggressively marketing a radically disruptive new medication to cure a disease. But when you look at the clinical trials, this massively expensive, highly complex new drug only cures the disease 6.5% better than the cheap, reliable generic that's been on the market for decades.
Okay.
Is entirely upending a school's operational norm, forcing teachers to completely relearn their profession and redesign their classrooms, worth a 2-point gain out of 40?
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered that the cheap, reliable generic is actually failing to cure the disease at all in the modern world?
How so? The control groups learn the economics?
You are using a thermometer to measure wind speed. When you evaluate project-based learning using tools specifically engineered to measure rote memorization, of course it looks ineffective.
The tests used in those Detroit and California studies were standard content exams designed entirely to measure the outcomes of direct instruction?
Exactly. And those exams were aligned precisely with the core economic standards the PBL curriculum was supposedly built to teach.
They were testing the foundational knowledge.
Yes, but they measure raw recall, not application. And application is where human cognition actually proves its worth. Look at the 2002 study using the National Assessment of Educational Progress data.
Okay, the NAEP study.
Right. When researchers separated out the questions that tested actual conceptual understanding rather than just rote vocabulary memorization, the PBL students outperformed the national average 63% of the time.
63%?
Because PBL isn't about memorizing a list of economic terms. It uses ill-structured problems, student-centered learning, and authentic real-world practices. It forces the brain to contextualize information. It mimics how actual innovation occurs.
Wait, let me pause you there. Because when you say ill-structured problems, my immediate thought as an educator, and frankly, if I put myself in the shoes of a novice learner, is pure panic.
Panic? Really?
Yes. Isn't handing an ill-structured problem to someone who doesn't even know the basics yet a recipe for massive cognitive overload? Walk me through how a 14-year-old doesn't just shut down when handed a complex project with no clear instructions.
It's a great question, and it comes down to the mechanism of organic necessity. PBL doesn't just throw kids to the wolves, right? It provides scaffolding.
Okay.
Think about the Kennedy space race, the ultimate historical example of this mechanism. JFK didn't say, hey, let's sit down and memorize orbital mechanics from a textbook for 10 years.
No, he presented a goal.
He presented a massive, ill-structured, grand problem, put a human on the moon, and return them safely by the end of the decade. The scientists and engineers at NASA had to organically acquire the necessary curriculum.
The physics, the novel materials science.
Exactly, the computational mathematics. They acquired it in order to solve the specific problem in front of them. That is what PBL does in a classroom. It creates a context where the knowledge is actually needed to achieve a goal, which anchors the learning in reality rather than just on a chalkboard.
That is a fantastic analogy, I'll admit, though I would frame the reality of NASA very differently.
How so?
Well, the engineers who put humanity on the moon already possessed a massive, highly structured foundation of direct instruction. They weren't novices trying to organically discover the laws of thermodynamics through group brainstorming sessions.
Fair, but
They were world-class experts who had undergone decades of rigorous, standardized drilling in mathematics and physics, which brings us to a crucial point. If PBL mimics real-world innovations so perfectly, why did we ever build this rigid, standardized system in the first place? Was it just a historical accident?
Not an accident at all. It was an intentional design choice for a very specific era.
Exactly. Let's talk about the Prussian origins of this model, because it is so often used as a pejorative, and I think that's historically ignorant.
We're talking about a system initiated in 1763?
Right, under Frederick the Great.
Yes.
And what did this standardized system actually do? It introduced tax-funded, compulsory schooling for all citizens. It professionalized teaching. It created mass literacy in a way the human race had never seen.
Sure. The scale was unprecedented.
And the mechanism of direct instruction is precisely why it succeeded. Cognitively, direct instruction minimizes working memory overload. A teacher who is an expert explicitly breaks down a complex concept, say, calculating marginal utility.
Okay.
First, the teacher models it. Then the class does it together. Then the student does it independently. It guarantees a baseline standard of quality. It meant that a poor farmer's child and a wealthy merchant's child were both systematically exposed to a foundational bedrock of knowledge. It is the intellectual engine that built the modern industrialized world.
I'm sorry, but I don't buy that it was fundamentally about equity or cognitive optimization. If you read the historical analysis of the Prussian system, it was explicitly designed to foster obedience, duty, and social control.
That's a very cynical read.
It's the historical reality. It was a reaction to the state's need for a compliant military and a docile industrial workforce. It is quite literally an assembly line. The teacher is the factory foreman, the school bell is the shift whistle, and the students are the widgets being stamped out to uniform specifications.
But again, that uniformity guarantees that every student reaches a verifiable baseline of mastery.
A verifiable baseline of mastery for a 19th century economy. That is the critical disconnect here. Let's look at the mechanics of what happens when you run that exact same factory model today.
You're going back to the India data.
Let's look at the classrooms in India right now. Over the past 2 decades, India expanded its engineering seats tenfold, from 150,000 to 1.5 million. Mechanically, what does that look like?
Massive expansion of infrastructure.
It looks like massive lecture halls, where students are forced to regurgitate code onto paper exams rather than actually building software on a computer. The factory went into overdrive, stamping out millions of identical, unspecialized engineering widgets.
Which led to the unemployment spike.
What is the result of that direct instruction? 60% of mechanical engineers and 45% of software engineers are completely jobless.
I acknowledge the severity of the degree inflation crisis in India, obviously, but I have to push back here. To blame massive graduate unemployment on the pedagogy of direct instruction, rather than on unchecked institutional greed and a failure of macroeconomic job creation, that seems like a massive leap.
I don't think it's a leap at all.
You are conflating the economic devaluation of a printed credential with the actual cognitive mechanics of how a teacher effectively transmits calculus to a student.
They are inherently linked, though, because the instructional model dictates exactly what the student values. Direct instruction values passive recall. Therefore, the student optimizes for passive recall.
Right.
And the economy no longer pays for passive recall. The data shows this isn't just a lack of jobs, it is a deep skills mismatch. The factory is producing obsolete goods.
Obsolete goods.
Think about it. The traditional university system is operating like an industrial assembly line, stamping out millions of identical flathead screwdrivers. But the modern labor market is looking for highly specialized, custom-built multi-tools.
So the problem is lack of specialization.
Exactly. We have massive unemployment existing alongside severe talent shortages in the exact same industries. Corporate recruiters are actively responding to this reality. Did you know 65% of them are now bypassing university degrees entirely to assess narrow specialized skills directly through portfolios and technical interviews?
Wow, 65%.
Yes, 72% say new graduates require massive retraining before they are even functionally productive. The degree has lost its signaling value because the pedagogy prioritizes seat time and standardized testing over dynamic skill acquisition.
Okay, so if traditional instruction is producing flathead screwdrivers, what is the alternative that project-based learning supposedly provides? What makes the multi-tool?
It provides the missing 80%. We have known about this massive blind spot for over a century. In 1918, the Carnegie Foundation commissioned Charles Riborg Mann to survey 1,500 working engineers.
Right, the Carnegie study.
He didn't ask them about their math scores. He asked them what actually determined success or failure in the field. The top 4 predictors had absolutely nothing to do with technical engineering science.
Let me guess. Soft skills?
Exactly. Number 1 was character. Number 2 was judgment. Number 3 was efficiency. Number 4 was the understanding of others. Because traditional direct instruction assumes students just magically acquire these complex interpersonal traits somewhere else, maybe at home, maybe on a sports team. It systematically ignores the 80% of what actually makes an employee valuable to a company.
So look, if you're a parent listening to this, you might be thinking, I just want my kid's school to make sure they know how to read, write, and do algebra. Why are we suddenly talking about corporate soft skills?
Because they matter.
Now, I don't dispute the 1918 Carnegie findings, nor the modern equivalents. Soft skills are undeniably important in life and work. But I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning when applied to educational policy.
Why not?
Because it assumes that schools can and should formally engineer human personality at the expense of hard knowledge.
It's not engineering personality. It's providing a structured environment where judgment, conflict resolution, and collaboration are actively practiced, which is exactly how a well-designed project-based learning classroom operates.
But let's look at the institutional reality you yourself just described. You cited the India study. One of the most damning statistics in that research is that 75% of engineering colleges haven't even updated their core course content in 5 years.
Yeah.
They are actively teaching software and mechanical principles that are half a decade out of date.
Yes, that's the horrific institutional inertia I'm talking about.
Right, but follow the logic here. I want to ask a very pointed question.
Okay.
If higher education institutions are so paralyzed by bureaucratic inertia that they cannot even update their technical syllabi to match current industry software, something that is highly objective, binary, and easily measurable, how can we possibly trust these exact same institutions to scientifically assess and teach nebulous, highly subjective personal traits like character and judgment?
I mean, that is a sharp critique of the institutions themselves, sure. But an institution's failure to adapt doesn't invalidate the fundamental necessity of the skills.
But they're the ones implementing it.
How does a student learn judgment? By being put in a project group, facing a real-world deadline, dealing with a team member who isn't pulling their weight, and figuring out how to deliver the final product anyway. You cannot lecture a student on how to navigate interpersonal conflict. They have to experience it.
My concern is that when we issue top-down mandates telling schools to pivot to teaching soft skills, we are handing them an unmeasurable excuse for abandoning academic rigor entirely.
Abandoning rigor?
Yes. In the empirical review we discussed, researchers noted that even something as straightforward as direct instruction was poorly defined across different scientific studies. If academics can't consistently define and measure a straightforward lecture model, how on earth are they going to objectively measure character?
Well,
Without rigorous, measurable definitions, soft skills just become a black hole where accountability goes to die.
accountability to what, though? Accountability to a standardized test that corporate recruiters are actively throwing in the trash.
No, accountability to basic foundational knowledge.
You are rigorously defending the structural integrity of a building that no one wants to rent office space in anymore. Yes, assessing judgment, adaptability, and collaboration is incredibly messy. It doesn't fit neatly into a multiple-choice bubble.
Which makes it almost impossible to scale equitably.
But just because something is difficult to measure on a spreadsheet doesn't mean it isn't the most vital thing to teach. By demanding absolute empirical precision in grading, you are forcing the entire global education system to optimize for the wrong variables.
I optimize for variables that can actually be transmitted reliably from one human mind to another, across diverse populations at scale.
At the cost of relevance.
When you have a teacher who is a genuine expert in their field, direct instruction allows them to systematically break down complex concepts, model the problem-solving process, and ensure that every single student in that room achieves a baseline of mastery before moving on. It is incredibly efficient, and it scales to millions of students.
And PBL doesn't?
When you rely on experiential PBL, you are incredibly dependent on the specific social dynamic of the student group and the almost superhuman improvisational facilitation skills of the individual teacher. And as the rigorous data shows, the raw score gains simply do not justify the massive disruption to the system.
It skills to produce millions of unemployed graduates. That is the empirical reality we have to face. We cannot keep looking at 5% differences on obsolete rote memory tests while actively ignoring 30% unemployment rates among our brightest youth.
The unemployment is a multi-variable problem.
But the data out of India is a massive warning light blinking red on the dashboard of global education. If we don't radically shift to models that force students to collaborate, to exercise judgment in highly ambiguous situations, and to build specialized experiential portfolios, we are knowingly dooming another generation to massive student debt and chronic underemployment.
Well, as we draw this discussion to a close, we really need to look objectively at what the evidence actually supports. I maintain that the highly structured, standardized approach to education, while admittedly imperfect and absolutely in need of modern syllabus updates, remains the most empirically sound, cognitively effective method for transmitting concrete knowledge.
Right.
And the foundational Prussian architecture of equity, scalability, and mass literacy is still highly relevant today. We must remain deeply skeptical of discarding this proven system for progressive experiential theories that, when rigorously tested under scientific conditions, show only marginal statistical gains and suffer from severe definitional flaws.
And I summarize my position by pointing straight to the world outside the classroom window. The traditional, structured model is demonstrably failing the modern student.
Demonstrably.
Yes. The stark macroeconomic reality of massive degree inflation, hundreds of thousands of unplaced graduates even from elite institutions, and a century-long failure to address the soft skills that drive 80% of actual professional success proves that a fundamental paradigm shift is required. Supreme efficiency in teaching the wrong thing is a recipe for generational disaster.
I will gladly acknowledge an area of convergence between us, though. We both agree that the current alignment between what academic institutions are testing and what the real world actually demands is deeply, deeply miscalibrated.
Yes.
The institutional inertia you highlighted, the failure to adapt, is demonstrably harming students.
Absolutely. Whether you personally believe the ultimate solution is better, updated lectures or better, more complex projects, the fact that universities are currently teaching 5-year-old software to future engineers is pure institutional malpractice. We completely agree there.
What this data ultimately shows us is that the friction between structure and experience isn't going away anytime soon. There is incredible value in acknowledging that the rigorous foundation of the past might need entirely new architectural blueprints for the future. We hope this exchange has illuminated the complexity of these competing taigajis, There is much more to explore in the source material regarding how societies define the true value of a degree, and we leave it to you to form your own conclusion.
It is ultimately a question of architecture. Are we trying to perfect a rigidly engineered skyscraper that was perfectly designed for an industrial world that no longer exists? Or is it finally time to build something entirely new, even if the blueprints are a little harder to read?